So if you consider some of the arguments around the evolutionary process of how humans have developed, and what generally makes females more nurturing is because they need to raise children.
Yeah, 100%,
Evolutionary
100%.
point of
Yeah.
view, and males needed to go out and hunt and protect the tribe. Does it throw a different level of analysis there? Because you have the psychological evolutionary approach, the biological evolutionary approach, and the social and sociological approach of understanding the differences from nurturing. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, well, for people who may not be as nurturing, can they learn or can they not? Considering and balancing those approaches and the utility of understanding those.
I don't disagree with you from an evolutionary point of view that those all those things you said are true. And then, yeah, for some people, that they might have a psychopathy where they're more psychopathic in their orientation. They don't have that empathy capacity. They're more the exception. I guess I'm speaking from a broader possibility of humankind. So I guess I'm speaking to the potential, really, and positing the possibility that we don't have, that humans have more a range of qualities of feeling at our disposal if we're willing to have a look at them and go there, type thing.
Yeah, I came across some research more recently. It was really interesting to see how much context plays in how these kinds of traits bring themselves up. He talked about very remote South American tribes who had a higher genetic predisposition towards violence because of certain genetic markers that
Yeah, well,
didn't regulate their neurochemicals of dopamine, serotonin, and that sort of stuff, as well as other, people like perhaps you and me, or probably the general population. But that was based on the necessity in their context. So what that means is a tribesman who grew up with more abundance, so more food sources, tended to have less of those violent tendencies. And those violent tendencies, from a genetic point of view, they weren't as highly valued, though they were still violent. They still had an underlying predisposition, but it didn't come about in terms of
right,
violence.
right, right, right.
Whereas there were other tribes who they would actually start counting how many people they murdered, and that would be seen as another rung in the ladder of social hierarchy, because they grew up in environments that were less well tended, and they had to go and fight for their stuff. And women were in those tribes, the women were more attracted to and bore more children with the ones that were more violent. It was so interesting how all this sort of stuff can come about from biological and sociological, I don't even know if sociological makes sense, maybe anthropological point of view.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. They sound, the way you're describing it, for me, it's like, yeah, in those tribes, it was socially and culturally important to have those qualities. And then again, I don't know anything about this, but epigenetics talks about the environment that you're in influences the genetics, and then the genetics can have an influence on how you are and what you respond to in the world. And it sounds, the way you describe that, one of those tribes is that violence is valued more. So then that social environment stimulates the genetic predisposition towards being more violent. So as you say, the violent gene gets more activated because that was socially accepted, socially sanctioned, and socially desired. And then it gets reinforced because the women were attracted more to more. So then that genetics then gets reproduced in future generations. So you can see how it gets reinforced. And then but does that mean it's permanent? Maybe, I don't know, for a few generations, maybe. Then you could put some other stimulus in there where there's more peacemaking, and then that it's not socially sanctioned. And so they get more ostracized, the more violent you are, it's not accepted, like, more similar to our culture, I suppose. And then won't become more peace loving. How long that takes, I'm just guessing really, but that's how I see it in my head anyway. Yeah.
It's so interesting, and I think this is a final point I'd like to make on that one. I used to come from a therapeutic lens until I started doing a lot more research into this, because I think it's so interesting to me because it's based on empathy and being able to relate, and from a clinical point of view, that's really important for me. And so understanding the caveats behind that sort of stuff is really important. So one thing that I thought was the epigenetic influence, and for those who might not be aware, epigenetics is how the environment brings about those types of genes that we might have a predisposition for. If we have a violent gene, so to speak, even though there are like 50 different types of genes that can influence, violence, if we have that gene and we get raised in a really beautiful, loving environment, we don't tend to be violent. And yet there are some evidence to the contrary. For example, adoption studies where children who have been adopted out to very beautiful, loving parents, but they came from generations of violence and criminality, but never met their never met their biological parent, and how they still took the path of violence. And there's so many stories out there and research that kind of goes into that, but that's not the purpose of today's discussion. I just thought it was a good caveat to kind of discuss in terms of empathy, in terms of connecting.